Good afternoon, first of all, and welcome to the AGS session at the ULF Family Conference. So I'm Patrick Winters, and I'm one of the parents that has been helping to kind of build up the Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Advocacy Association. And I need to get a handle on the computer first. And away we go. So before we begin, I just have a few things that I want to make you aware of. So first, this session is being recorded, and we intend to make it public on the internet. So if you don't want to show up on video or on camera, avoid it. You can repeat your questions, and we can say them aloud for you. And if you're on the Zoom, you can do the same. Because second, we're also presenting this session virtually. So that means that we have some attendees watching on the internet, and we want to make this as accessible to them as possible. So we encourage you, if you're watching the live Zoom, to leave comments and ask questions in the chat. And we'll do our best to monitor the Zoom meeting and repeat questions aloud. And we have Lauren Lowry here. She's helping out right now, and I will be on the Zoom when others are presenting. And third, we intend to have the session translated. So we opted to forego live translations. That's something that ULF offered, but because we don't have that many virtual attendees, our plan is to transcribe the recording and translate it into captions when it goes online. And lastly, I just want to remind everybody that we are volunteers. So those of us that organized this session, the talk, the presentation, we did it in our free time while parenting, managing AGS, juggling our careers, and trying to meet the needs of our family members. So if I or we have done a poor job, just offer some empathy and understanding. And if we have done a great job, please let us know, because it can be very difficult sometimes to maintain the motivation and enthusiasm to keep going at this. So I keep losing my cursor, so I'm going to try and get it back. There we go. I skipped a slide. So we have the next 3 or so hours broken into 3 sections with about 15-minute breaks between each presentation. And I want to acknowledge and recognize that many of our most enthusiastic and engaged community members, some on the call, they tend to be our newest. And so for the first section, I want to provide a primer, an introduction of sorts to Aicardi-Goutieres syndrome. But before I do that, I'm going to start by explaining what the Aicardi-Goutieres Syndrome Advocacy Association is and what we've been working on. And then we'll cover the basics of AGS, and I'm going to offer our perspective. This is the organization's perspective on where things are heading, and that is drawn from a year's experience networking and injecting ourselves into clinical and scientific work. After we take the first break, we're going to invite Dr. Francesco Gavazzi. He's going to come and share what he and his colleagues at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia have learned about AGS, and that's learned from your participation in their AGS natural history study. A natural history study, and this one in particular, is a concerted effort to catalog and describe our disease and its consequences so that we can prepare and plan for the future, and so that we can run effective clinical trials. And to our knowledge, and I would like to see if you would agree, that I think that we have the largest and most comprehensive active natural history study in the leukodystrophies. So many of you in the United States have sat with Dr. Gavazzi, participated in evaluations with him. We want to make sure that you know about the potential that your children have. I am actually going to present some things that he may recover, but I'm going to try and do it from a less scientific perspective. And after our final break, we've invited AGS mom Lauren Lowry. She's in right here. And she's going to round out the AGSAA's mission because we recognize that our families have a lot on their plates. A large part of succeeding as a family dealing with AGS involves reframing the circumstances and achieving a more balanced perspective. So Lauren is here to help. All right, so for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about this little organization that we've been building and how we see it improving the lives of your loved ones. So I told you I'm Patrick. I'm the father of a 5-year-old with AGS. She's my daughter, Aurelia, and I've been working closely with a handful of other parents for about 1.5 years to shift the community mindset towards taking charge of our future and being active participants in research. Now, the AGSAA was originally founded in 2015 by a group of parents, and some of them actually remain on our board of directors. And they recognized a need and an opportunity to advance research efforts in the Americas. And they founded the Aicardi-Gutierrez Syndrome Americas Association. But since then, no spam caller, no thank you. Since then, our community has grown, and we have more opportunities to help our children that we believe requires a global scope. So we renamed ourselves the AGS Advocacy Association, renewed our purpose, and expanded our priorities. Now, I want to be clear, and I think we all at the AGSAA want to be clear that our intention is to faithfully represent the needs of AGS families around the world. So we recognize that there is unequal access to information, medicines, and expertise, and we aspire to level the field so that all children with AGS can reach their maximum potential. And we built this map from home locations volunteered by members of our support group. And while we see representation outside the U.S., and I know it's a little blurry, but you can kind of see in the background, we recognize that we're not reaching many parts of the world. And we think that we can't make a difference without your help and engagement. And I might not be speaking to you all in the room. I'm speaking to people that are going to come across this recording in the future. And so we need your help and engagement. And we're going to continue to do our best, and we ask for your feedback and participation in our efforts. Now, we're a coalition of parents, and we want to work with clinicians, researchers, scientists, health agencies, you name it. And we want to improve the lives of everyone with AGS, and we think that that very much involves anticipating the needs of those that will be diagnosed in the future. And we have a lot to learn from families that have come before us. So we see this work being more successful when we include the past, the present, and the future. And so we wrote our mission statement to focus on rescuing potential. We're serious about proactively providing information, emotional support, and connections to preserve quality of life and get families what they need to reach their potential. Devin Cordova, our executive director, she's on the call. She coined the term rational optimism, which is a term that I really like because we acknowledge how serious and challenging our circumstances are, but we work to create the conditions that will allow everyone to thrive. And I believe, and I think we all believe, that knowing and accepting our reality is critical to being informed and critical to identifying opportunities. So we also sometimes say that AGS means always growing stronger. And we believe that you all have the power as advocates and as a community of families to ensure that we gain strength and knowledge from every scientific research or clinical advancement. And lastly, we recognize the diversity of both our AGS, the diversity of the disease, and of our families. And we are committed to meeting people wherever they are in their journey. So we like to think that we are organizing and motivating a community through social media, our patient registry, our private support group. So if you're a family affected by AGS, we, the AGSAA, want to be a beacon for you. And that's both to provide you with as much as we can, but also so that we can connect you with a community that is mobilized and actively working to improve circumstances for their kids. And from a recent examination of data from genetic testing laboratories, I've talked about this study a couple of times today, we know that our community is much larger than most people realize. And I believe Laura Adang said that it may be the most common leukodystrophy. I won't hold you to that, but it communicates the reality that we are a very large community and we are much more common than is published and that people realize. We also know that we're a diverse group. Not only do we have 9 known associated genes, but we also have a spectrum of experiences and symptoms and severity. And we've learned, I believe, that early diagnosis and treatment can rescue potential. And we organize through our patient registry and our support group that has over 1,100 members. So I added this slide fairly recently. It was just something that kind of came to my mind because I said that I work closely with Devin. And while that's certainly true, there are a lot of people that have been a part of our efforts. And so I took a look at some of the numbers from the last 6 months to get a sense of how much networking we've been doing and how much time that we've been spending. And I've personally sent around 300 emails. I've spent over 50 hours in meetings, and I've been face-to-face with 5 different drug companies and scientists from 10 different labs that work on things closely related to AGS. And I think that this is the work that you don't see that goes into what you do see. We're putting our time and our energy into networking so that we can forge connections and relationships that might lead to solutions for your children and ours. And I promise I'll be done soon about the AGSAA, but I want you to know that we have a website, and we have resources for families on our website. It's agsaa.org. We've got a guide to help you get quickly oriented to the diagnosis. We've got clinical care recommendations. We have a deep dive into our only disease-modifying treatment. And we even have a template letter that can help you families appeal health insurance denials for our medicine. So I encourage you to take a look if it's been a while. And we've also been maintaining pretty regular posts on social media. So if you don't follow us, please do. Our handle is AGS Advocacy, so at AGS Advocacy on most channels. But you can find links to our social media channels at the bottom of our website. And in addition to sharing family stories and pictures and birthdays, we actually regularly try to educate by explaining scientific and clinical topics on social media, for example, reverse transcriptase inhibitors and things like that. And we'll occasionally make requests and announcements about things like new clinical trials, patient registry surveys, media campaigns, things like that. And most recently, our marketing director and AGS mom, Betty Trevino, has launched a podcast that will do deep dives into family stories, introduce AGS doctors and scientists, give a voice to those living with AGS, and more. And all of that can be found through our website. Now, I want you to know that we have an AGS patient registry that is managed by our organization. And you can find a link to join or enroll, log in on our website. Now, a patient registry is sort of a system designed to collect structured information about a disease directly from individuals affected by that disease. And often, patient registries are used to produce what's called a natural history of a disease, or they can be a part of that, which is a comprehensive understanding of the disease's symptoms and trajectory. And we're going to hear more about that from Dr. Gavazzi really soon. But because AGS has a well-developed natural history study at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, we've used our registry to more quickly explore topics and collect experiences about matters that are important to families but potentially understudied. So, for example, early in the pandemic, we asked for and then shared experiences with COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccination, and we produced a report on disease triggers and flares in AGS. And so I have some demographics on the left, and then the two on the right are images that we shared on social media. It might be a little difficult to see, but we essentially produced a heat map of potential triggers that were reported by parents and the severity of a flare of the disease that they experienced with those triggers. And we also did a comparison of frequency and severity of flares for children on JAK inhibitors and not on JAK inhibitors. Now, with respect to the patient registry, I can share from personal experience that the pharmaceutical industry, and I think these are the businesses that are going to make decisions about whether or not to invest in developing new medicines for our kids, they have a strong interest in working with diseases that have well-organized registries like our own. And I think this signals to them that despite being a rare disease, AGS has a community of families willing to participate in research and hopefully clinical trials. So I encourage you to join. Our registry should continue to become more important and relevant as work in our disease continues. And I want you to know, for those that have concerns, that our patient registry is anonymous or de-identified. So we don't know who participates, and you can withdraw your information and participation at any time. Another thing I want to show you here is that our partner Biogen, they're a drug company that we've worked with in the past and continue to work with. They sponsored the establishment of our registry, but also sponsored a program that was offered by the Public Benefit Corporation that hosts our registry software. And this program identified topics that are interesting and important to AGS registry participants. So basically, everyone was given a big list of topics. Those that participated were asked to quickly choose just a few topics. And those topics that were selected by many participants happened to be statistically significant. And the board that provides oversight for our registry, they allow us to run surveys and studies related to any of these topics without any additional overhead. And I think that this gives us a lot of power to describe our disease, our needs, and the burden of it from our own perspectives. But we're able to do so in a manner that will be accepted and acknowledged by health regulatory agencies like the FDA or the EMA in Europe. And I think that this has been a guide for us, telling us what families want to know about or what they want help with. And just going through a couple of these, the top topic and concern was muscle tone management. Number 2 is something that we ran patient registry survey and study on, flare-ups, what's causing flare-ups, immune flare-ups in the disease. But as we go around, there's a number of things that we haven't even gotten close to touching or talking about. So we intend to go through this list as quickly as we can. Another thing that's coming soon, or I guess this is the first thing that I'm sharing that is coming soon, is Project ECHO. So the AGS ECHO program, it's my baby at the moment. And in short, we're going to organize Zoom meetings that any doctor or healthcare provider can join to learn about AGS and discuss their patients and cases. So you all won't be able to join. It's not for families. Rather, it's for families, doctors, therapists, nurses, and healthcare providers that care for those with AGS. We want to bring your teams up to speed, providing a forum where your doctors and AGS experts work together to reach consensus about how to treat their patients. And I think through it, we'll democratize knowledge about AGS and help bring expertise and advice to everyone, regardless of where they live. And so I'm hoping to launch this program by the end of this year, but truthfully, that's difficult, so don't hold me to it. But we'll be sure to heavily publicize this so you can invite your care team to participate when it's ready. And also coming soon, we have a few webinars in the works, and these might be live or they might be pre-recorded, but we'll try to use them to introduce and inform. And you may or may have not seen a recent announcement that we made about working with the drug startup Transposon. They have an active clinical trial for AGS in the participation sites are only in Europe, and they're using a new reverse transcriptase inhibitor, or they're developing one. And we plan to produce a webinar introducing Transposon, the trial, and what participation looks like. And we think that'll help everyone understand what they're getting involved in. And we also have a longstanding relationship with the drug company Biogen, and we have plans to present a webinar very soon with them. And I think we'll be looking to highlight key opportunities and share important information about AGS in these webinars. All right, so that's all I have about the AGSAA. I'm going to try and stay on time. I was going to offer to answer a couple of questions, but if you have any, just hold them till the end. And we'll try and get them all answered. I have about 30 more minutes, I believe. All right, so I'm going to have to move quickly because I'm going to try and give you an overview of AGS from a parent and advocate's perspective. And to the best of my ability, I'm going to try and answer these 4 questions. I'm going to start by taking a look at how AGS affects families emotionally. I want to try to explain this disease to you, but I want to ground it in a real sense in our day-to-day. And then I'm going to offer a quick explanation of how the disease works. And I think the context is important because it helps explain a little bit where I think our opportunities lie. And we want to make sure to cover available treatments. And then I'm going to offer our perspective about what's coming, what's on the horizon for AGS. And again, that's been developed from about a year or so of networking. So what is AGS? It's every one of these kids. And these are all young people whose lives are impacted in deep and meaningful ways. AGS almost always results in physical disability, sometimes what we call profound disability. But sometimes even between siblings, like the two on the left, the consequences can be unpredictably different. And we have an idea why this is the case, but admittedly, it still confuses and surprises me every time. And I'm reminded of something Dr. Laura Edeng said from CHOP. I'm going to allude to her again. She told me last year that she now almost always tests for AGS because it can be so different and unexpected. And admittedly, that's in the context of a children's hospital that specializes in leukodystrophies and comes from a pediatric neurologist, so AGS still belongs in a pretty specific category. But the disease bucks a simple, straightforward explanation, and that complicates our attempts to describe it, write care guidelines, and measure changes in clinical trials. But we'll talk about clinical trials later. I want to show you more kids. And I actually asked parents to share pictures that embody what AGS means to them. And I expected things like pictures of living rooms full of equipment. And I got one or two of those. But for the most part, people just shared smiling pictures of their families, right? And I'll share what a couple of them said along with the pictures. I heard that this is a hospital picture from April. It shows strength and smiles throughout the pain and suffering. I heard that AGS kiddos have the best hair and the most contagious smiles, always making the best of life and bringing joy to others. We heard that AGS, because it's a life-limiting condition, means that you have to make the most of the life that you have, think positive, be positive, and make the most of every good day. But I also heard that it's hard and painful. And I know this. I'm an AGS parent, and I think, you do. Other parents here know this too. And we also recognize and know this because some of our kids and their families are struggling. Now, I got a lot of pictures, and I felt the obligation and responsibility to show as many as I received, so they're all here. And it's going to take me a minute to get through them all. I think these scenes are interesting to me because they look an awful lot like my house and my family. I have millions of pictures that look the same. I did get a caption that I didn't write down, but the picture on the left was that this boy used all of his energy to walk himself and communicate to his parents that he wanted to go outside to see the snow. So he got to do it. And let's see if it comes through. It's telling me that the pictures don't work, but I promise I had pictures of my daughter that I wanted to show you. And I wonder what happened. So now for this presentation, I asked families how this disease has affected them. And truthfully, because this is most often an early childhood disease, I focused on the parent perspective. But adults and children living with AGS have a lot of their own to say, and I want to let you know that we're beginning to provide them with a platform to do so through our podcast. So if you want to share, you can contact us, and everyone else subscribe to hear a different perspective than this, the parent perspective, straight from the source. But back to the parents, I selected some choice quotes, and I arranged them from left to right. You might say a little more negative on the left, more positive on the right. And as you read some of these, I kind of propose that you think about these as not representing a distinct or unique attitude and perspective, but rather they all represent a continuum of feelings that all of us truthfully travel through. And I know, and I can share from my own experience, that my answers to this question probably change month to month, week to week, or even hour by hour. It's an emotional carousel, and it can be really dizzying at times, but despite that, most of us, I believe, try and manage to find a balance. We mourn and we sometimes grieve, but we move forward and make the best of our time together. And you'll notice that uncertainty is a really big contributor to the stress and anxiety that we feel. I think the uncertainty is that we don't know. Truthfully, we don't know sometimes if we're in the early stages of mourning our children or if we should be preparing for a long life that happens to include disability and chronic illness. But when we can manage that anxiety, if we can redirect it, it sometimes means that we can really cherish our moments as parents and put effort into the growth and development of our families. So I don't see this in families that haven't been touched by something like AGS. I think I see it in most of the families here at the ULF conference. But I wouldn't expect other people to have this experience or to be able to relate anyway. And I just want to share, I wasn't surprised by this, but for some reason, this question also seemed to highlight that pretty much everybody's kids think farts are hilarious. And I think you know what I'm talking about. But, I think what it means is that we can't be doom and gloom all the time. And our kids with AGS are still kids. Okay, so now I have some more drier stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about symptoms and clinical features. And I can't get too specific, but I just kind of want to give you a sense of it. So we're here at the conference for leukodystrophies, right? So it should be pretty obvious and clear to everyone that AGS is primarily a brain disease. The consequences of AGS-related brain damage can be profound, and it's very likely to be the consequence of the disease that has the most impact on the life of someone with AGS. The associated brain damage or brain inflammation will probably cause disability, can result in seizures, and will probably lead to secondary issues like the inability to speak, eat, swallow by mouth. And there may be uncontrollable movements or orthopedic issues because the brain can't control muscles properly. A person with AGS can even lose the ability to regulate their heart rate, temperature, and blood pressure. But I think that we all kind of get this because it's visible. These are the things that we can see. These are the visible effects of the disease to us. But I want to be very clear that there is much more going on. And even if we don't have specific numbers, there have been lots of publications over the years highlighting all sorts of systemic complications. Because AGS is an immune disease, the effects of having an overactive and reactive immune system can damage almost every organ in the body, including the immune system itself. Now, we don't yet have numbers or very clear numbers on how often some of these specific issues arise. So many of us are doing a lot of annual testing for things like glaucoma and pulmonary hypertension. And, I can only speculate on why these systemic issues occur, but I do think there's a commonly held belief that the inflammatory signals in AGS weaken and damage small blood vessels, which leads to organ damage. But regardless of why this other organ damage occurs, it means that a person with AGS should probably be thought of as having a serious chronic illness in addition to having a brain disease and disability. And I want to say that one of the ways that we're going to learn and be able to clearly describe these symptoms is through the natural history studies being done at CHOP that Dr. Gavazzi is going to share, and he is going to share some novel information about systemic involvement in AGS. And I think it's the kind of information that we all need to anticipate things for our kids. But for now, on our website, we have a work in progress booklet that covers a lot of these chronic symptoms and effects. And while it's not exactly an easy read for families, I do think it would be worthwhile to take a look and share with your doctor. Now, I also asked parents what symptoms have had the biggest impact on the lives of their children. And this, again, is just a sampling of what some of them said. And, while you read these, I'm going to share that we held a focus group with a number of families last year with a drug company, and a similar question or similar questions were asked and answered. And at the time, I was really surprised at how much consensus there was about communication, or let's say difficulty with communication, being the most impactful consequence to most or many families. So for those families, it's not necessarily the disability or the lack of independence that causes the most difficulty. It's the struggle we have to communicate effectively with our kids. I share this struggle too. But that's not everyone. And many children with AGS are dealing with pain or life-threatening complications. And it's because AGS has a wide spread. So this is one of the things that Dr. Gavazzi, I know, has in his presentation, so I'm going to cover it from my perspective. This is the AGS scale. It's the way that we have at the moment to measure and think about the severity of AGS using a scale that was developed at CHOP. The AGS scale is a way for doctors to measure how severe the outcomes are for people with AGS. And so this wonderful team at CHOP here developed a short, simple questionnaire, and it scores the severity of a person's, quote, overall global neurologic dysfunction, basically the severity of their brain damage. And so there's a list of 11 features, and they're on the left. And so for each item in the list, a patient can receive 1 point. If this feature applies to you or you have this feature, there's a point. And you add up all the points for all the person's features, and the maximum score is 11. And so I want to step through the first 4. Normocephaly, it's the absence of microcephaly. Microcephaly is a small head size, which can happen if there's brain damage really early on in life. The brain doesn't grow at the same rate, and therefore the skull and the head doesn't grow at the same rate. Social smile would be the ability to smile in response to your mom or your dad or friend coming in the room, right? Communicating through a smile that you are paying attention and you're aware of their presence. Vocalizations like cooing or babbling would be, say, the ability to get attention by making noise, having your parents pay attention to you or get their attention. And single meaningful words might be a word like mom or dad, just the ability to use a single word to communicate. And I want to stop there. So if you only have those 4, we've described a score of 4 on the scale, and it lands you kind of right around the boundary of what doctors would consider severe or moderate AGS. And on the rightmost chart, each triangle here represents an individual child and his or her score. And so the majority of children with AGS that were measured here for this publication would score about 4 or below. And I think that's extremely sobering. It means that they lack the ability to speak, hold their heads up, grasp things with their hands. Truthfully, independence has been completely robbed from them by this disease. And communication, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. It's extremely challenging in those cases. And so this scale continues all the way up to independent walking. And I want to point out that the 3 AGS types on the right, there are children that are profoundly, I clicked ahead. There are children that are profoundly disabled that have AGS associated with these genes. And there are children that are walking around and playing baseball. And, the swing here is really wide. But I don't want to confuse you. I'm not suggesting that mildly affected children are not hurt by this disease. They still very much are. This disease is just very difficult to capture in very simple terms. So I'm going to cover this and hopefully do it quickly and well, but as of right now, we typically associate 9 different genes with AGS. And I believe Dr. Vandiver told us last year at our family symposium that these genes, these 9, account for about 85% of the cases that she sees in clinic. It's going to be really hard for me to explain genetics in any sufficient way, but I kind of have to try a little bit because it's going to be relevant to the next couple of slides. So what I'll say is that the instructions for life, you've heard of your DNA, they can be broken down into units. And there are a lot of caveats here, but these units are called genes, and they specify the order of molecular building blocks that are assembled into molecules called proteins. And we have about 20 to 25,000 genes in our DNA. And the proteins that they specify often have very specific purposes, and they interact with other very specific proteins and molecules. These interactions are charted on this graph here. So everything about you, about life on Earth, it all arises from the interactions of these molecules inside and outside the 100 trillion cells that make up the human body. And those numbers are really mind-boggling, so this is a severe simplification. But AGS can be caused by a change in the instructions of just one of these associated genes, so one of these 9 out of 25,000, that ultimately causes the gene's protein to operate a little bit differently. And all of the genes associated with AGS can be thought of as having jobs that help maintain a sensitive, fragile balance that our cells keep related to protecting us from infections. So as a result of an unfortunate change in any one of these genes, the balance is lost and our cells become convinced that they're experiencing something like a viral infection. They sound their alarms, producing interferon, which is down here at the bottom of the chart. And interferon is a signaling molecule that calls up basically the National Guard and institutes martial law. Everything around the cell and in the cell tends to shut down. And while most of the genes are labeled on this diagram, these arrows show how all of these the proteins that are produced from these genes and some other molecules, it shows how they interact and the ways in which they interact to produce interferon. And so with that said, when one of you says that your kid has AGS2, it means that they have a change in the gene RNase H2B. And those changes cause it to stop working so well. But if you have AGS7, it means that you have a change in the gene IFIH1 that causes it to work too well. And I actually picked these two because, to me, it's kind of like they're cousins. They have different parents, but they're from the same overall family. And ultimately, these genes can cause an overproduction of interferon, but they do so in slightly different ways by interacting with their different parents. And so just kind of as an example, I organized them on the right under two different categories under their different parents. And I did that because I think in the coming years, we are probably going to see medicines that target specific parents. And so right now, we're all in the same boat. Those of us using JAK inhibitors like baricitinib or ruxolitinib, these drugs, they have very broad effects on things that are well after any of the AGS genes have sounded the interferon alarm or triggered the interferon alarm. But in the future, I think that we're going to have better medicines that only work on one of these categories or some other subsets of AGS. And I'm sharing this because it's not hypothetical. So in the last couple of months, I've personally had meetings with drug companies and scientists that are developing drugs and molecules that would work this way. And it's very likely the case with reverse transcriptase inhibitors now, which you can read about on our website and are in active clinical trials for AGS. But the point is that as we get closer to the source of the interferon, we expect the medicines to work better and be more specific and have fewer side effects. But it might mean that we see a split in the AGS community, medicines that work for some AGS types that may not work for others, and we may not have equal efficacy. So in terms of leukodystrophy, the AGS genes, I just explained, cause an overactive immune response, but we don't yet know exactly how that specifically results in the disease's brain damage. What we do know is that AGS results in the destruction of the brain's white matter. And that's the term, that's where the term leukodystrophy comes from, and it is why we're at the United Leukodystrophy Foundation's conference. Leuko means white, dystrophy refers to it being damaged and wasting away. And I think this graphic helps me, and I think it helps to visualize exactly what the white matter is. And so I hope that you might have heard about neurons. These are the cells in the brain that send all of the electrical signals that our brain uses to control our bodies, form our consciousness and our memories. And these neurons, where they connect, because they're distinct individual cells, but where they connect, they have an fatty insulating layer that's created by another cell type. And this insulation is called myelin. The myelin helps the electrical signals travel efficiently across the connections. And we need myelin, and we need those connections to travel efficiently from our heads all the way down to our toes for us to be able to walk. And where we have many connections and lots of myelin in the brain, we have dense bundles of neuron cables that connect different regions of the brain. And so you can imagine that without myelin and without this white matter, our brain cannot communicate as quickly or as effectively. And if there's a process that's resulting in the destruction of myelin and white matter, it can continue and it can cause further destruction and damage to the neurons themselves. And this might be a bit of a simplification, but the way that I see it is that where we see calcifications on brain MRIs, which are clusters or deposits of calcium, it means that those sections of the brain have been heavily damaged and effectively filled in with calcium. And in AGS, we often see this in the basal ganglia. This is the section of the brain that primarily controls movement. So, as it relates to leukodystrophy, we know about the interferon, and we're pretty certain it's being produced in high amounts in the brain by another cell type called astrocytes. And they're kind of like a support cell or like an immune cell. They're there to help out. But we don't really know exactly how it results in leukodystrophy and AGS. So we sometimes talk about cellular targets. In fact, Dr. Hoffer, we were talking about this earlier, that cellular targets would be the specific cells or the specific cell types that we need a drug to impact. And in AGS, we really don't know for sure which ones we need to target. So for example, if we could magically just turn off the interferon and astrocytes, truthfully, I think we're not sure that this would cure the disease. So I bring this up because figuring this out is kind of a precursor to developing the next generation of treatments, like gene therapies and gene editing, that I'm somewhat hopeful that I'm going to see for my daughter while she's still a child. And I'm going to allude to Dr. Adang's talk, treatment modalities in leukodystrophies, where you just spoke about in the future, we're probably going to be able to target specific cell types with certain treatment or therapy modalities. And this question needs to be solved for us to do that effectively in AGS, and it has not yet. I skipped 2. So many families find out about AGS through genetic testing. Once their doctors begin to realize that there are issues that are something more than cerebral palsy or some kind of acquired or regular infection, they might order a gene panel or whole exome sequencing. And with whole exome sequencing, a laboratory reads the DNA from a blood sample that you send them, and then it checks each gene in the blood or in the DNA against genetic databases, and it uses computer software to see if there's anything in the gene that might be associated with or potentially causing disease. And with a gene panel, they're basically doing the same thing, but they're only looking at a handful of specific genes, so it's more targeted. Microarrays aren't really relevant to us, but they are related to interferon score, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when genetic testing fails, or often if it hasn't been ordered yet, doctors might be looking at brain MRIs and noticing damage, possibly damage that follows a certain pattern associated with leukodystrophies or maybe even AGS. And in fact, it was an MRI that prompted genetic testing for my daughter. They ordered a leukodystrophy gene panel. And the answer often comes from the genetics for many of us, but that's not really where the diagnostic journey begins. So before or without obvious genetics, diagnosis can be very complicated in AGS. Many doctors still search for what we would call classical AGS symptoms or classical AGS features. Those are features that were described in early publications about AGS, and they are not always features that exist in patients, like calcifications in the brain, for example. So they might draw samples of spinal fluid. They might find that there are signs of an infection or inflammation in the brain, and that itself can be confusing, and it becomes a puzzle that can sometimes take years to solve, especially when we're working with outdated information and publications about AGS. So you might have heard about interferon score. We talk about this sometimes in our support group. Interferon score or interferon-stimulated genes or interferon signature generally means the same thing. This is usually measured from blood samples, and it tells us whether the immune system is being turned up by interferon. Now, in the United States, we don't actually have a hospital or a laboratory that's licensed to perform this test clinically. Still, I'm aware of families getting this test done anyway, both in the US and around the world. But the problem is that it's kind of a research thing, and we can't rely on it yet to help diagnose families. And what's more, these values don't really tell you how severe your AGS is or is going to be. They just tell you whether or not you have it. So for the time being, kids that don't have obvious AGS genetics and that don't match the standard picture, they can go years without getting a clear diagnosis. And that likely means a significant delay in treatment. Now, one way we can speed up diagnosis is by updating the literature. We can publish more complete information from natural history studies. But what will really make the difference for AGS and probably for every rare disease is the development of newborn screening. So in the developed world, a drop of blood is typically collected from a baby at birth. They tend to prick the heel. They put a couple of spots of blood on a card. And that blood is tested for conditions that the government has on their list. So developing newborn screening for a particular disease is complicated, and it involves at least all of the steps that I have listed here. We have to identify and validate that a particular molecule can identify AGS in the first place. That's done in a laboratory. We need to collect as many newborn screening cards as possible for this because they need to be used to verify that the test may work. And that's even more complicated for us given that we have so many different genes involved in this disease. And there are details about particular AGS genes and types that make some of this even more complicated. And then once we discover or identify these molecules and we validate them, we need to run a pilot program. And that's the use of a test in a smaller group, which can be a small set of hospitals or even a whole state or a province. And we do that to demonstrate whether or not it works in practice in the real world. And eventually, it gets to the point where we, as an advocacy organization and as a community, need to advocate to have our test included in each state, province, and country on their list. And we're not going to be effective at this without showing that identifying kids early can and will make a difference. We need a proven treatment. So like everything else, this is going to be a lot of work. But we have opportunities here too. And we've already helped collect a large number of newborn screening cards. Thank you, Nico. And our partners have identified a handful of candidate molecules. Some of this has been published. And we think we have a compelling argument about treatment. And so even though this is complicated right now, for example, in an adjacent room, Lisa Brackbill is speaking about the Leukodystrophy Newborn Screening Action Network. So we have people that will be able to help us. My ask is that if you do have a young one, you can donate their newborn screening card. So many states and countries hold on to them for a long time. Some do not. But some hold them for years, especially California and the United States. So you can email us at info@agsaa.org, and we'll figure it out and we'll set things up. So I have to cover treatments. We have so much information about JAK inhibition, and we talk about it so much on our support group that I kind of want to run through this slide very quickly, but I think it might not be fair to do so. But we really have put an enormous amount of effort into educating families, sharing experiences, and providing resources to help families get access to JAK inhibitors. So we talk constantly about baricitinib and ruxolitinib in our support group, and this is our treatment. This is our only disease-modifying treatment at the moment. It's really all we have when we talk about available treatments. I want you to know that we as a community, not the AGSAA, but we as a community have a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine detailing the treatment protocol and its benefits. It shows that kids using this medicine, in this chart on the left, they gained more developmental skills using the medicine than kids when they weren't using the medicine. And we have recommendations from the American College of Rheumatology and the European Alliance of Associations for Rheumatology, or EULAR, that confirm that JAK inhibition can benefit AGS and other diseases involving interferon. But I'm going to be honest that these are powerful drugs, and we are forced at the moment to give them to our children at very high doses, higher than what these drugs are approved for adults with different conditions. So I'm also not going to lie and say that they always work. Some kids continue to experience progression of the disease, or at least relapse, despite JAK inhibition. But there are also many that describe an improvement in their sleep, their pain, and so on. And again, I want to be clear that these drugs do not fix brain damage, but when they work, they prevent more of it. And so I'm going to leave it to you all to read our testimonials because I think that they say an awful lot about this. And I'm going to just add in here that we, through our patient registry and surveys about JAK inhibition, we have about 75% of families saying that JAK inhibitors have benefited them and that they've had a positive experience with their symptoms and irritability and sleep. It's all on our website. It's agsaa.org/JAKi. But the landscape of our treatment is really rocky. And so, we feel very strongly, and I feel very strongly, that every kid with AGS should be treated with JAK inhibitors and treated as early as possible, but they often are not. We try to, as an organization, we try to contact every newly diagnosed family that we can to make sure that they understand the medicine, the situation, and the trade-offs, but we're still seeing significant delays for many families. And so we collected, through our patient registry, we collected treatment timelines from families, and we found that the average time to treatment after having a diagnosis in the last couple of years runs about 6 months. And so on this chart, each line segment represents a single person, a single individual affected by AGS. The yellow alert at the top of the line is when they began to experience symptoms or the onset of their disease as the parent reported it. The blue looking glass is when they were formally diagnosed clinically. And the green pills are when they finally access JAK inhibitors, with some children on the right still unable to access these medicines. And I want to say that these kids, they're suffering the worst consequences of this disease potentially for years before they manage to access treatment. Now, what are the reasons for that? There are probably at least these. The barriers that they face or the obstacles might be that their doctors hesitate. Not a lot of doctors know much about AGS nor these medicines. And the doctors and the families lack the time and experience to argue and fight insurance companies. Those insurance companies that they are arguing or debating with, they immediately deny these medicines in most cases. And they have an easy time doing so because it's expensive. These medicines are expensive, and because they're prescribed at high doses, and because they lack a special designation for AGS. So we are legally allowed to use these medicines. We are legally allowed to be prescribed these medicines in most countries. But insurances and health systems typically don't have AGS and JAK inhibitors on their lists. So we seem to struggle. This is kind of another point. We seem to struggle, particularly in Europe, with the belief, and this might be the doctor belief, that these medicines don't work or that they're not worth using. And I want to be clear about what these medicines can and can't do. They cannot fix brain damage, but they can lessen the inflammation that causes brain damage in AGS. So we don't know who they will and won't work for, but we do believe that everyone with AGS deserves a chance. We believe that we can say that they are mostly working for the majority. And finally, the manufacturer of baricitinib, and this is the JAK inhibitor most extensively tested in AGS, I'm going to share with you that truthfully they do not intend to invest further in AGS and baricitinib. So I'll share that our online petition that we ran, the media campaign that we ran, raised over 4,000 signatures, and we did get the attention of Eli Lilly. We had multiple meetings with representatives from the company to discuss how we might improve this situation, but unfortunately the bottom line is that they're not going to help us get this drug approved for AGS. So I don't know the answers for these. I think about this a lot. But I'm sharing it with you so that you all understand that this is a challenge that we're going to continue to face until we have better options. And that's why I'm here, that's why I'm giving this talk, and that's why we all need to work together. But we do have other opportunities on the horizon. We have active clinical trials right now for AGS. And so first, we have reverse transcriptase inhibitors. And you can read more about these on our website. We've shared on social media, and we have some information on our website about them. These are medicines that were developed to fight HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. But it also happens to mean that they've been used safely in children, and that they've been used for many years safely in children, and that they come with a much lower cost. So these drugs, if they work, if they're beneficial for us, could be combined with others like JAK inhibitors without dangerously suppressing the immune system. Reverse transcriptase inhibitors do not suppress the immune system, so they can be part of a combination therapy that might be getting some of our kids over the hurdle that they're experiencing. And I also mentioned previously that we might see medicines that target interactions closer to the AGS genes, or what we would call upstream targets. And so rather than broadly suppressing the immune system, we might actually be able to interrupt the disease without as many side effects. And these drugs are in development, but I'm truthfully uncertain whether or not or when they'll make it to the light of day. So we hope that by networking and funding projects that we can help move these forward. But I think that we should also recognize that there are other medicines for other immune diseases that may work for us, including other JAK inhibitors that may have fewer side effects. I had it written down on my paper, but I don't have it in my notes here, that AstraZeneca actually got a monoclonal antibody approved that blocks interferon alpha receptors, and it was approved for a form of lupus, SLE. There are diseases related to ours where medicines may become available, not intentionally for our disease, but we may be able to repurpose them. And just kind of as an anecdote, my child's been a patient in a clinical trial of one. She's been the recipient of a cellular therapy known to have anti-inflammatory effects. In that particular case, her doctor and I have discussed opening a trial for AGS, but testing this or other anti-inflammatory agents, or even canvassing other approved drugs to repurpose them for AGS is going to take money. But I think it's always possible that we could strike gold. And so we need, and our organization plans to establish significant fundraising efforts to raise money needed for this angle. And I want to wrap this by sharing that we've been told, sort of unofficially, but we've been told that there are as many as 11 companies in the AGS drug development pipeline. And I can't independently confirm that, but I am personally aware of at least 3. And I think that if we want these companies to invest in AGS, we need to organize, engage, and participate in research as a community. In terms of open clinical trials, we've got some information about these on our website. At the moment, these are for reverse transcriptase inhibitors and CHOP's natural history study under the protocol, the Myelin Disorders Biorepository Project. But I want to emphasize, as I wrap up, because I'm nearing the end here, that we want to be able to run effective clinical trials in AGS. And that does not mean that the medicines are effective. What it means is that the conclusion of the clinical trial is unambiguous and definitive. An effective clinical trial is going to measure things that are important to families, and it will demonstrate clearly whether a medicine has a benefit or not. And in the baricitinib trial, the outcomes that described benefit were developed retrospectively. And this means that we ran this trial, but we tried to justify the benefits of these medicines after it had begun. And health agencies, they won't go for this. So we're getting in front of this now with a collaboration with CHOP to develop outcome measures that can be used in future clinical trials. And the only way that I know of, and I say that with a smile because I'm not an expert, but the only way that I know of to design an effective clinical trial for a rare disease like AGS requires a robust natural history study, a natural history of a disease, an engaged and active community, and a feedback loop that brings the concerns of the community to the forefront. So we are very fortunate, I think, to have some of the pieces of this underway, and we're going to hear about a big part of it from Dr. Francesco Gavazzi in just a bit. And so finally, I'm basically done, but before I offer to take any questions, I just want to touch on what you can do as AGS friends or family to help us make progress. The first thing that you can do is follow us on social media. Our channels are linked at agsaa.org/socials. But in active terms, you can donate your newborn screening cards. You can enroll and participate in our patient registry. And with respect to our patient registry, you can help us select topics and design surveys about things that you want or need to know. And please share and reshare us on social media. Tell your network about AGS, friends and family. Promote the AGSAA in our posts, because we're always going to need to raise awareness and funds, truthfully, if we're going to make a difference. And I wrote please multiple times here, but I'm going to say it one time. Please educate yourself about research opportunities and clinical trials available in AGS. We're willing to do the heavy lifting and provide information on our website, but we need as many people as possible participating in trials for them to be effective. And, we have more than we can realistically do. And so if you raise your hand to volunteer, we will try and give you a scoped and well-defined project and goal. And so for information or help with anything, you can contact us at info@agsaa.org. And with that, I'm done. So thank you. And let me know if you have any questions.
Hello, everybody. I am Lauren Lowry. So let's see if I can get over here. I am an ICF accredited life coach and a fellow AGS mom. So in this presentation here, we're going to talk about a few different things, about why so many of us feel mentally and physically and emotionally drained. I think that's something that we can all relate to, that it just kind of wears on us. And it's no matter how much sleep, no matter how much rest you get, you feel like you're just always exhausted. So we're going to talk about what is the real cause behind that, and then we're going to talk about how to have more energy and feel less overwhelmed by managing your child's care and just the day-to-day things that come with this life. And we're going to talk about why self-care is not the only answer, because I feel like sometimes it's the only answer we're given. So, but a little bit of background here. Let's see. So, my son Leo, a lot of you guys know him, I know in this room at least. He is 7 years old. He has TREX 1, type 1, AGS. And whenever we first got the diagnosis, it was very hard, right? We were essentially in the genetics office, and after all this time of testing and poking and prodding and hospital visits, trying to figure out what was wrong, we got the call from the genetics team. They said, "We have an answer for you. Come in." So we went in. They handed us a paper that looked like it was printed off of Google and said, "He has this. Good luck." And we kind of just were like, well, what now? And they didn't really have an answer for us. They didn't give us any direction on how to do this job. So we felt really lost. How do you do this? How do you be an AGS parent? We had no direction. And from there, that was kind of the starting point of my journey on everything just changing. You know, I started to push away my friends and just kind of isolate myself. I felt very alone. I became really irritable and I was angry a lot. I, again, was exhausted all the time. I was throwing myself into researching all that I could about my child's new diagnosis. And even whenever it wasn't a new diagnosis, even years in, I was still researching. I would stay up really late at night with a glass of wine and a bowl of ice cream, and I would just search Google for anything that I could find that would help my child, because I just wanted what was best for him. And I felt like I was not able to give that to him, so I just kept looking and looking and looking. And what I didn't know at the time was that I was experiencing symptoms of living in a chronic state of survival mode. It all starts in our brains. And what that does not mean is it does not mean it's all in your head. But what it does mean is that it is actually something going on inside your mind, your brain, and the makeup and everything. So what is survival mode? So survival mode is our brain's response to stress. So this could be something like a large medical bill that you get in the mail, or it could be a tiger chasing you. But it is what sends your brain into a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And when we have that chronic, unresolved stress day after day, and it goes unmanaged, we remain in that constant state of survival mode. And our survival brains, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but that's your downstairs brain. Your survival brain doesn't know the difference between that large medical bill that you got that you were not expecting, or a tiger literally chasing you. Your survival brain thinks those are both life and death situations, and it treats them so. Now, there may be less adrenaline coming with the medical bill. It may cause more of like a freeze response, but it is still perceived in the same area of your brain as that stressful event. And some of the symptoms that you can experience with survival mode, which I would just want to make a little note here, that survival mode is pretty much, if you're living in that long enough, that is what will eventually turn into burnout. So some of the signs and symptoms of survival mode really do cross over into burnout. You have things like anxiety. You will experience maybe anger or rage. You feel disconnected, just kind of like you're separate from everything. You may experience memory loss or brain fog. I personally remember the brain fog. I thought that I was experiencing kind of, the pregnancy brain or that postpartum, but then, 4 years postpartum, you probably shouldn't be experiencing brain fog anymore. You may be more irritable. There's a lot of avoidance of tasks, so procrastination. There's an impaired focus, so you kind of lose the ability to focus on things. You don't feel present. Overeating or drinking, so using things to avoid that negative feeling and to make yourself feel better. Overwhelm, impulsivity, a hard time making decisions, and of course the mental and physical exhaustion. And what this might look like for you in your own personal life, it could look different for everybody. Everybody's experience of survival mode is different. But it could be snapping or lashing out at your family, over something small. It could be zoning out and procrastinating, scrolling on social media for longer than you really ever intended, or watching Netflix, just kind of trying to numb out. It could be feeling anxious and regularly thinking of those worst case scenarios on repeat, almost like a loop in your head. In survival mode, living in that chronic state of survival mode, it impacts not just our mental health. It impacts our physical health. It impacts our relationships, our marriages, our children, our careers, and therefore our finances. It impacts your life overall. And I like to tell the clients that I work with, I like to tell them this, to forgive themselves for the things they did when they were living in survival mode. Because the things that we do, the anger and the rage and fighting and all of that, or just kind of feeling disconnected from everybody, those are just symptoms. They're not character flaws or things that are wrong with you. They're just things that you're experiencing as a result of all the stress that's going on. But what can we do? How do we get out of that chronic state of survival mode? Because we can't get rid of the stress in our lives. Let's just admit it. We can't get rid of everything that we experience. We can't get rid of the grief that we feel over the life we expected. We can't get rid of the sadness that we may experience when we see kids that are typically developing, maybe in our kids' classrooms or things like that. But what we can do is we can help ourselves move from the downstairs brain to our upstairs brain. So our downstairs brain is our survival brain, like we said earlier. While the upstairs brain, our prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for your higher thinking. That is where you will have your problem solving, your emotional regulation, executive functioning, planning, all those kind of things. And when we're living in survival mode, we don't have access to those functions. And so, of course, if you aren't able to regulate your own emotions, of course you're going to lash out at your husband for leaving the toilet seat up, or of course you're going to, avoid certain tasks because your brain just wants to not have that executive functioning because it's living in the downstairs portion. So how do we move from that downstairs brain back up to the upstairs? This is the part where people tell you, practice more self-care. But I personally hate the term self-care as a special needs parent because no, we all need self-care. I'm not saying don't take care of yourself. I am a big advocate for it, but the term self-care itself has gotten skewed. The term self-care has become things that feel good, things that are temporary, bubble baths and pedicures. And those things are great, and those things do help. But in our lives, the reality is that we don't always have the means to take care of ourselves. Exercise is a great way to move your brain from survival mode, living in the downstairs, to the upstairs. That is a great way. But if you're in a hospital and your child's in the hospital for weeks, it is not always easy to slip out every day and go to the gym. So like I was saying, we don't have enough time for self-care a lot of times. It becomes more about what feels good instead of what our bodies actually need. So a good example of that is whenever self-care is just what feels good, like I said, bubble baths, pedicures, instead of maybe things like eating well, exercise. We don't always want to do those things, but those aren't what we typically think of when we think of self-care. But when we process the stress, it doesn't reduce the amount of stress that we experience. So that's the problem with self-care, is it doesn't reduce what we are essentially taking in on those things that we cannot get rid of. But there is a missing piece to the puzzle. So there is something else along with taking care of yourself that can really have a strong, lasting, positive impact on how you feel, and a really strong impact on just your day-to-day life, on all those things that survival mode is affecting. And that is getting rid of your survival mode beliefs. So survival mode beliefs are beliefs or thoughts that lead to chronic stress and living in a constant state of survival mode. So this is what I was meaning by it does start in our brains. Now, this isn't things that we make up. This is things that are unnecessary stress that we can eliminate in our own lives. So some common survival mode beliefs that I see quite a bit are things like, if I ask for help or admit that I'm struggling, they'll think I'm a bad mom. Or I'm not doing enough to help my child. If I say no to doing this intensive therapy, or fill in the blank to whatever that is, then my child will suffer. Doing something for myself is selfish. There are more important things that need to be done. And I just want to stop on that one real quick, because that is saying that you are less important than things like laundry, dishes, all those other things. You're putting yourself last whenever you have that belief. I shouldn't feel sad about my child's diagnosis. Other people have it worse. Thoughts like these do not serve us in any way. They just increase our stress. Other AGS families are doing more than we are. We should do the same to keep up. Kind of a keeping up with the Joneses mentality. So whenever we have these survival mode thoughts or beliefs, they can create feelings inside of us. So every thought we have creates a feeling, and create feelings of guilt and shame, of inadequacy, lack of confidence in our abilities to take care of our children and parent. And the survival mode beliefs can result in unrealistically high expectations that we should be doing all the things all the time, which can result in us overworking essentially. Unmeeting our personal needs, not meeting our personal needs. And all of those things, all of these right here on the screen, are what are leading to our additional chronic stress. But the good news is that our thoughts and beliefs are not facts. And we can actually retrain, you can rewire your brain to think differently so that you do have less of that chronic stress and you experience less of those survival mode symptoms. So negativity bias. So our brains, they're hardwired to think negatively. It's called the negativity bias. And it is actually a survival mechanism. And it is something that our brains do to keep us safe. But what actually ends up happening is that when our thoughts are constantly leaning towards that negative side of everything, we actually end up creating more pain and more suffering for ourselves in our lives. With the negativity bias, we only see our own personal flaws. We believe that we aren't good enough. We dwell and obsess over something that someone said to us that we didn't like. We remember the bad days and the hard parts, but we tend to forget the good days and the happy moments because our brains are just wired to only focus on the bad. It's nothing, again, it's not a character flaw or anything wrong with us. It is just a natural response, but it is something that you can actually reprogram your brain to go away from the negative and more towards the positive. And these survival mode thoughts, they end up leaving us mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. Because again, you think that you need to do all the things all the time, and you think that you are not as important as everything on your to-do list. You end up draining yourself. So how can you start ditching these beliefs, shifting your mindset to get out of survival mode? And step one, it's awareness. So whenever you become aware of the thoughts that are creating that additional stress, and you're understanding how they're impacting you, that is the first step towards being able to shift them. So this is the thought cycle right here. So in the thought cycle, essentially what it is we have a thought in our brain, just a sentence, it's not a fact. And then that thought creates a feeling. And from that feeling, all of our actions, inactions, behaviors are driven. And the accumulation of all those actions and inactions and behaviors gives us our results. So if you have the thought, I'm not doing enough to help my child, that might give you the feeling of guilt, right? Comes with that. And from that feeling of guilt, your brain actually wants to avoid any kind of negative emotion. So what it's going to do is it's going to tell you, oh, you know what? Let's just pick up our phone and scroll on social media for a minute. Let's turn on Facebook or whatever, Instagram. Let's turn on the Netflix. Let's do something to distract ourselves. Let's add something to that Amazon cart and get that dopamine hit from shopping. Anything to distract ourselves from feeling that guilt. And the results that we end up with is that we actually end up doing less from that thought, I'm not doing enough to help my child. It's because our thoughts will always be the driving forces behind our actions or lack of actions, inactions, procrastination, right? When we feel guilty, we beat ourselves up. We tell ourselves that we aren't doing enough. Our brains perceive that stress and it goes into, typically for guilt, it goes into a flight or a freeze mode. Makes you just clam up, run away, hide away. What do we do when we feel overwhelmed? You have all these things going on in your life. And this one is tricky because overwhelm is also a symptom of your chronic stress. So it's kind of a double whammy. So whenever we feel overwhelmed, it causes a freeze response. You sink into the couch. Try to forget that long to-do list you have by scrolling on Facebook. You avoid taking action because your brain has convinced you the task will take longer or more energy than you actually have. I don't know about you guys, but I know that if I have a basket of laundry to fold, I will always say that I don't have time to do it. And I timed myself one time, just for fun, to see if this was true. And it took me like 5 minutes to fold this whole basket of laundry that I could have swore would have took an hour, 2 hours, definitely. So our brains will always try to convince us that we don't have the time or the energy to do certain things. And overwhelm also activates that stress response, sends you into that survival mode, and it impairs your ability to problem solve. And we need that ability to problem solve in order to get everything done on our to-do list ultimately, right? You need that executive functioning ability to be able to tackle all of the things. So after you have awareness of your thoughts and you kind of start to see how they are playing out in your own life, step 2 is to start questioning those thoughts that are not serving you. Our brains love evidence. We love to be right. It's not just our brains. Like, we all love to be right because we are our brains, right? We unknowingly will look for the evidence that supports our current beliefs, while ignoring that evidence that contradicts it. Goes back to the negativity bias. Our brains want to only see the bad parts because it wants to look out for the things that could potentially harm us. That tiger, that large medical bill. So if we have the belief that we never have enough time, our brains will actually take notice of all the times we are extra busy. It will remember the days when you were scrambling from appointment to appointment. You were trying to fit in the tube feedings in between, and you had phone calls going off. You had insurance calling you. You needed to respond to that email from CHOP. I don't know, maybe just me on that. But your brain will remember those days and just kind of conveniently forget the days where it's not like that because those weren't as stressful. Those weren't as impactful. Our brain says, not important. So in order to get rid of a thought or a belief that isn't serving us, we must first build a case against it by asking ourselves questions like, when is this thought maybe not true? What else might also be true? Is this 100% always true no matter what? And you ask yourself that for something like, I never have enough time. Is this 100% always true no matter what? No, it doesn't. And the more you can start proving to your brain, almost think of it like a court case. You have to build the case against your brain. And whenever you do that, the more and more you do it, and you poke holes in that story, the more you will be able to get rid of that belief, the more and more your brain will not fully believe it. But on that same note, shifting your mindset does not mean gaslighting yourself. It doesn't mean toxic positivity. Because if you are not ready to believe something, that doesn't mean anything bad, right? You don't want to force yourself to believe something you're not ready to believe. And shifting your mindset is not about just believing the complete opposite, you know? We're not here to say, oh, I have all the time in the world, life is grand, everything's perfect, because that doesn't work. It's about making just small little changes here and there in a way that feels good to yourself. You still want to validate how you feel and what you're experiencing. It's just about questioning and being curious. So, like I said, shifting your mindset and belief, it's a process. It happens in steps. You're not going to go from one extreme to the other. And you have to have a sense of curiosity and self-compassion while you're doing it. You can't beat yourself up for feeling a certain way. And the process of poking holes in your story and just really questioning and saying, okay, what else could be true here? How else could I see this? Is there another way of thinking about this? So with step 1, we became aware of our thoughts, right? We started to see how they were impacting us, how they were making us act and show up in our lives. Step 2, we started to kind of question that story and question whether we really fully wanted to believe that thought. And then step 3 is whenever we can really do the work of being intentional with our own thinking. We call this intentional thought creation. So with intentional thought creation, it sounds very woo-woo-y, right? It sounds very weird. But whenever you are able to get control of your own thinking, it really does give you a freedom that I can't even begin to describe, because you are able to impact how you feel and how you act, how you show up. And if you've ever wanted to hit a goal, this is how, because it lets you overcome things that were always holding you back, like procrastination or maybe motivation, things like that. It all starts with how we are thinking about things. So you become the watcher of your own thoughts. You know, we have things that come in and out of our brains all day long. A million different thoughts. I'm sure there's a number. I think it's like 40,000 thoughts a day. But we don't have to believe all of them. We can actually choose which ones we are going to give power to, which ones we are going to give attention to. You remember that thoughts are just sentences in your brain. They are not facts. And a great tool for this, a great, exercise, if you will, is to do what is called a brain dump or to journal. So this is where you just set a timer for 10 or 15 minutes and you write out everything in your brain. You just get all of your thoughts out of your brain and onto paper. And that will help you separate. You can actually reread that brain dump you just did. You can go through it and you can highlight in yellow everything that is a thought. And the way you know it is a thought is, would this uphold in a court of law? If the answer is no, then it is a thought. Highlight all the thoughts in yellow and cross out all the facts or highlight them in a different color. And that will really help you start to see that my brain is just making things up, right? We just have this whole set of things going on that we can actually begin to control. So, and we can begin to replace the survival mode thoughts with new thoughts that are believable to you, but also serve you, that aren't causing you to take less action, aren't causing you to go without meeting your own personal needs. And the more that we do this intentional thought creation, the more natural and automatic it becomes. Now, this is something that it does take work. And at first, it feels very odd. And it's different than, mantras where you put something up there that, really inspirational quote. Because typically with those, you're not ready to believe them. You want something that is still. You need to meet yourself where you are with thoughts that feel good. And the more and more you practice those new thoughts, the more natural they become. And before you know it, all of a sudden, you don't have that original belief anymore. So let's go back to the one, I'm not doing enough to help my child. If you have that thought, you can replace it with an intentional thought, or actually a question for yourself. What is one small thing I can do this week that will help my child move closer to their goals? And let me go back real quick, because with the first thought, we talked about that earlier, creates a lot of inaction. Because our brain is saying, I have to do all the things, I'm not doing all the things, so I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough, I'm going to go hide away and do nothing, right? Where the next one, it opens us up to curiosity. It's a question. It opens us up to just a small thing. Your brain is probably going to be like, oh yeah, I can do one small thing. That's easy. Okay. And is specific. What is one small thing that will help my child move closer to their goal? Rather than just all the things, maybe you aren't being specific to what really matters most. So the first thought makes our brain feel like it has to do all the things all at once. Well, the second thought, it releases that high expectation that we put on ourselves. It allows us to make incremental changes instead of no changes at all. And you may even find yourself, well, one small thing isn't enough. And you have to catch yourself and realize that's your brain doing its thing again, thinking that you aren't enough if you can't do all the things. But if you do one small thing is better than no things, and you have to kind of tell your brain that. People say I'm crazy. I sound like I'm talking to myself, but But the more survival mode thoughts that we can untangle and that we can switch out and you become aware of, the less stress that we experience. And whenever we experience less of that stress, the less time we will spend living in that chronic state of survival mode, and you will prevent burnout. The less time that we spend in survival mode means that we will have more physical and mental energy. It means that we will have more capacity to be present. And it means that we're more focused on the things that matter most to us and our families, our children. Because we can't eliminate the stress and the challenges that come with our lives, right? There are certain things that we will not be able to get rid of, and we wouldn't want to not feel certain things like sadness about our child being sick, right? We don't want to get rid of that kind of stress. That is human stress. That is part of the human experience. But what we can do is decide how we show up and how we respond to it. We can decide what is serving us and what isn't. All right, that is all I have for you guys. So, does anybody have any questions over this?
We have a hot mic. There we go. Lauren, if people want to talk to you more or if they want to learn more, how do they contact you?
Yeah, so I have several different ways that you can contact me. I actually have a weekly podcast that if you want more information on survival mode, on stress, on changing your mindset and shifting it, on really just life in general as a special needs parent, it is Overcome the Overwhelm. It is on Apple Podcast, iTunes, all the main podcast platforms. So that comes out every Thursday. And then if you want to reach out to me, go to LowryLifeCoaching.com. That is my website. And I am, of course, on Instagram. So.
If nobody's...
Which one? Oh, the website? Yes, it is LOWERY lifecoaching.com.
So we don't have any more questions on Zoom, so I'm going to ask you a couple,
Yeah.
Because I think that first 15 minutes just basically described the last couple of years of my life.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there was ever a moment in your experience that really put you over the edge and made you realize, like, I have to do something differently.
Oh, there was several moments. I do distinctly remember a time where, and this is really personal, but I'm pretty much an open book, but Leo had been in the hospital quite a bit. This is, in and out and everything, and it was really hard. He was still in that very irritable stage. And I realized that I was eating my feelings quite a bit. At the hospital, I was in the cafeteria at all times trying to make myself feel better. I was, after every appointment, I'm going to treat myself to some ice cream to make myself feel better. And really what I was doing was avoiding everything. I was avoiding paying certain bills because I just didn't want to open the envelope. I was avoiding answering phone calls or dealing with things because I just didn't have the capacity or the bandwidth to deal with it. And what really struck me, which, this isn't, a topic about weight loss or anything like that, but I realized that I had weighed more at that point, a couple years postpartum, than I did at 9 months pregnant. And I started thinking, like, what is going on here? And, started really digging into what, they say, oh, weight gain is caused by stress, and that is true, but really it's caused by the symptoms I was avoiding of stress and how I was avoiding them. So that was kind of the tipping point for me, was a lot of the avoidance and everything I was doing in that point. Yes?
Have you ever seen yourself or felt yourself go manic for a day and do everything and get everything clean and then then that day's done and you go back to crawling in bed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think some of that is a little bit human nature, right? We have to have a little bit of grace for ourselves on that because some days we do feel better than others. And actually, if you guys listen to the podcast, I have an episode where I talk about this. It's the spoons theory. And the spoons theory is what they use in a lot of different chronic illnesses. I believe it's mainly predominantly used within the autism community. But the spoons theory is how different days we have different energy amounts. You have more spoons on certain days than others. And I think that the same goes true for us. We can kind of borrow that from that community because there are certain days where our kids need our full, undivided 24 hours a day, 7 days a week attention, and other times where they maybe need less of our, attention. And we kind of have to decide, how many spoons do I have today to give, and be okay with that and plan accordingly for that.
Here we go. I'm going to share that I'm familiar with the spoons theory.
Yes.
Because, and I attribute it to the stress and anxiety of parenting a child with AGS. I developed psoriatic arthritis. It might have been something that would have happened anyway, but I think that it very much has to do, or it very much is a physical manifestation and consequence of, unrelenting stress, essentially. And I share that because I'm wondering, I know you've worked with other AGS families, and I wonder if there's any anecdotes you can share without giving away personal details or anything about the difficulties that they've faced and maybe the successes that they've had sort of reframing things for themselves.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yes. And not even just AGS families, but I've worked with a lot of other, families of other diagnoses and things that are similar, things that are not similar, and some things that they've overcome, right? Is that what you were? Yeah, in ways that they've shifted. Some big ones are in their marriages. This is a kind of a common theme or in their relationships, even if they were not married, that whenever we are in that survival mode space, we're not able to be our best selves. And that's okay, but it does have an impact on our marriages. But whenever we start to kind of get out of that place and we feel more calm, we feel more present, we feel more just kind of a sense of peace, less overwhelmed, that will have a direct impact on your marriage. And there's a direct correlation, and it's something that kind of a funny thing that I have seen just time and time again, that whenever we start to shift ourselves away from thinking, I need to do all these things, and I'm not a good parent if I don't do all these things, or putting all that pressure, you also end up putting pressure on your spouse to do the same because they're not doing enough either, and it becomes this struggle. And whenever you just release those expectations, you both get to breathe. It's going to definitely impact both in a good way. Another thing that is probably a little bit more specific is I worked with a family. She was trying to get something approved it was a different state, so I'm not really sure, but like a certain type of like home therapy. And they kept denying it, but she really felt strongly that she needed this to be done for her family to thrive. And so in a coaching session, she was like, I have this coming up. I'm really stressed about it. Last time that I talked to them about this, it became this huge blow-up fight. It was awful, and we can't get it approved. So in that session, I will never forget this session. We talked about essentially going at it from a different way. And this is something that we're all told to, be the mama bear, fight for it, go in guns a-blazing. And we think that's what we're supposed to do. And it sometimes doesn't work that way, right? Sometimes you have to catch more flies with honey. And so what essentially we ended up doing was she came up with, some intentional thoughts that helped her go into it from a place of teamwork. I don't remember the exact thoughts specifically, but they were things that gave her feelings of love and connection to those people that kept denying her. And she came in it with more of like hey, how can we help my child more? What can we do? And they approved it. So, that was like a specific one that our thoughts really directly impact how we show up, the things that we say, how we say them, and the results that we get from that. Am I going to say that that's going to work all the time? No, but it does work. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, guys.